The chain was long enough to let her stand and short enough to keep her from the awning, which was the part Royce Tillman had thought about most. Della Mercer understood this the way you understand a thing you cannot do anything about. If the snow had come straight down, she might have found a foot of dry boardwalk to crouch on. But the wind in Cawley came off the bighorns in the last week of November, and it did not come straight down. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. It came sideways, low and patient, and it found her where she stood with her wrists bound to the iron hitch rail outside the bank, and it laid its fine grit against her cheek and her collar and the backs of her hands until she stopped feeling the separate flakes and felt only the long, single cold of being left. She had been there since the middle of the afternoon. The light was failing now, going from white to the gray-blue of an early winter dusk, and the lamps were coming up yellow in the windows along the one street the town had. People had passed her. That was the thing she would think about later, when she could think about it without her chest closing. Not the cold and not the chain. The passing. The Hadley sisters had crossed to the far side of the street with their market baskets, and their eyes fixed on the middle distance. The blacksmith had stood in his doorway with his arms folded and then gone back inside. A boy of perhaps 6 had stared at her with open animal curiosity until his mother took his hand and pulled him along, and even then he had looked back twice. None of them stopped. None of them said her name. A whole town had decided, in the quiet way a town decides things, that she had become a thing it was permitted to walk past. She had not always been a thing to walk past. 2 years before, she had been Della Mercer of the lodgepole place, the woman who brought eggs to the church social and sat in the third pew with her husband Thomas, and people had nodded to her on the street and meant it. Thomas had a way of being liked that did not require effort. He was a tall, slow-moving man with a laugh that came up from somewhere deep, and he had filed his homestead entry on 160 acres along Lodgepole Creek in the spring of 1878, when the grass came up green to the stirrup and the whole country looked like a promise that had been written down and signed. They had built the cabin together. They had dug the well together. They had buried 2 winters and 3 calvings and a stillborn son together on that ground. And Della had come to think of the land not as something they owned, but as something that owned them, in the good way, the way a thing you have bled into owns you. Thomas had died in March. He had gone out in a late storm to bring the heifers down from the high pasture, and he had come back with a cough that turned to lung fever inside of a week. And on the 9th day, he stopped breathing while Della held his hand and told him it was all right to rest. He was 41. The ground was still frozen too hard to dig, so he had lain in the cold shed behind the cabin under a tarp weighted with stones until the first thaw, and Della had sat with him out there in the evenings because it seemed wrong to leave him alone in the dark even then. That was the spring. By summer the trouble had started. By November she was chained to a hitch rail in the snow. The man who put her there was Royce Tillman, and he had not done it with his own hands, because men like Tillman do not do anything with their own hands. He owned the bank. He owned, through the bank, a good portion of the notes that the ranchers and merchants of the valley had signed over the lean years, which meant he owned a good portion of their willingness to look at things his way. He ran cattle too, for 1,000 head and climbing, and the thing his cattle needed more than grass was water, and the best water in that part of the territory ran cold and steady down Lodgepole Creek through the southwest corner of the Mercer homestead. Tillman had wanted that creek for 6 years. Thomas had told him no for 6 years, politely the first time and less politely after that, and Tillman had waited, because waiting was the only kind of patience he had, and he had a great deal of it. When Thomas died, Tillman came to the cabin with a paper and a soft voice. He sat at Della's own table and drank her coffee and told her, with the gentle regret of a man delivering weather, that Thomas had owed the bank against a note signed in 1880, a freight loan and a cattle loan rolled together, and that with the interest it had grown to a sum she could not hope to pay, and that the land would have to answer for it. He had brought a quitclaim deed already drawn up. He had brought a pen. He told her that if she signed, he would forgive the difference and even pay her a small sum for her trouble, enough to get her back to wherever her people were. He told her it was the kindest thing for everyone. He spoke the word kindest the way some men handle a knife, easy, like it was nothing, like he had done it so many times it had stopped meaning anything to him at all. Della had not signed. She had told him that the homestead had been patented, that Thomas had proved up and the government had granted them the land outright the previous year, and that a patented homestead was a different thing from a raw claim, and that she would not put her name to anything until she had read it through and understood it and talked to someone who knew the law. Tillman had smiled at her the way you smile at a child who has said something charming and incorrect, and he had folded up his paper, and he had left. What happened after that happened slowly, the way these things do. A man came from the bank to say the cattle were collateral and drove off 11 head. The store stopped extending her the small credit every ranch family lived on between sales. The magistrate, a thin, nervous man named Pugh who held his office at Tillman's pleasure and knew it, sent word that there was a question of debt and vagrancy to be settled and that she should present herself in town. When she came in to settle it, meaning to lay the patent on the table and be done, she found that the question had already been answered without her. She was, the papers said, a debtor in willful contempt, a woman with no visible means and no clear title, and she would be held until the matter was resolved. There was no jail in Cawley worth the name. So Tillman's foreman, a square, quiet man named Briggs who did what he was told and slept fine after, had chained her to the rail outside the bank where the whole town could see her, and Tillman had let it be known, without ever quite saying it, that the chain would come off when the deed was signed. She had stood there through the afternoon. She had decided, somewhere in the second hour, that she would not sign if they left her there until the spring thaw took her the way it had nearly taken Thomas. It was not courage. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. Even then, even with her hands going from pain to numbness to a deep, stupid ache. It was not courage and it was not principle, exactly. It was that the land was the last true thing Thomas had touched, and signing it away to Royce Tillman felt like burying her husband a second time, and she could not do it twice in 1 year. She could be cold. She had found out a great deal that year about how much cold a person could be. The light went from gray-blue to nearly dark. The lamps burned. The wind kept up its low sideways work. And down at the south end of the street, where the road came in from the river, she heard the slow clop of a single horse and the creak of a heavy wagon, and she did not look up, because by then she had stopped expecting anything to come up that road, but more of the same. The wagon stopped. The horse blew. There was a silence, the particular silence of a man taking the measure of something, and then a voice she did not know said, low and even, not to her, and not quite to anyone, "Well now." She looked up. The man who had stopped his wagon in the road was big through the shoulders and gone a little heavy with the years, and he sat his bench seat with the loose ease of someone who had spent more of his life on a wagon than off one. He had a graying beard cut close and a flat-brimmed hat dark with melted snow and a face that was not handsome and not unkind, a worn face, a face that had been left out in the same weather she was standing in for a great many more winters than she had seen. He was looking at the chain. He was looking at her wrists where the iron had rubbed them raw. He was looking at the snow built up on her shoulders and in the part of her hair, and something in his face was changing as he looked, slowly, the way a sky changes. "Ma'am," he said, "how long have you been out here?" She tried to answer and found that her jaw had gone too stiff to work properly, and what came out was not words. He set the brake and climbed down off the wagon before she finished trying. He moved faster than a man his size ought to, and he came up onto the boardwalk and crouched in front of her and looked at the chain where it ran from her wrists to the rail, the iron padlock crusted with ice. And he said a word under his breath that men say when there are no women they respect within earshot, and then he looked up at her, and his eyes were not soft, exactly. They were furious, but the fury was not aimed at her. "Who did this?" he said. It was not a question. It had the flat weight of a thing a man says when he has already decided to do something about the answer. The bank door opened. Lamplight fell out across the snow. Royce Tillman stood in the doorway in a good wool coat, and behind him the square shape of Briggs, and Tillman looked at the wagon and the horse and the big man crouched on his boardwalk, and he said, in the patient, reasonable voice that Della had come to hate more than she had ever hated anything, "Amos, I wouldn't trouble yourself over that. It's a town matter. Debt and contempt. It'll resolve itself." The big man, Amos, stood up. He turned around slow. He was a head taller than Tillman and twice as broad, and he looked at the banker for a long moment without saying anything, and when he did speak his voice had not risen at all, which was somehow worse than if it had. "You chained a woman to a rail in a snowstorm," Amos said. "Over money. Over a great deal of money," Tillman said. and over a refusal to be reasonable. I'd ask you not to interfere in what you don't understand. The law's been satisfied. Pugh signed the order this morning. Pugh signs what you put in front of him. A small muscle moved in Tillman's jaw. Take it up with the magistrate, then. In the meantime, that woman stays where she is until her debt is settled. That's the law in Cawley. Amos looked at him. Then he looked at the chain. Then he reached into the bed of his wagon, under the canvas, and came out with a heavy file and a pair of long-handled fence pliers, the kind every rancher carried, and he knelt down by the rail again. What's the debt? He said, not turning around. Tillman named a figure. It was an obscene figure, a figure built out of interest piled on interest, a figure no widow with 11 head of cattle confiscated could ever pay. Amos was quiet a moment, working the file against the lock shackle. Then he said, I'll pay it. The town did not move. The wind did not stop. But something went still in the doorway of the bank, and Della, half frozen and barely able to follow it, understood that the big man had said something Tillman had not been ready for. You'll pay it, Tillman said. I'll write you a draft on the Fenton bank for the full amount tonight, and you'll give me a receipt marked paid in full, and you'll take that chain off her, or you'll explain to every man in this valley who owes you money why you'd rather watch a woman freeze than take cash money laid in your hand. Amos stood up. He had not gotten the lock yet. He left the file hanging, and he faced Tillman square. Your choice. But you'll make it now, because I'm not standing in this snow arguing with you, and neither is she. It was the kind of move that worked because the man making it did not need it to work. Della saw that much. Amos Carrow was not afraid of Royce Tillman. And the reason he was not afraid was that he did not want anything from Tillman, did not owe him anything, did not need anything Tillman could give or withhold. And a man like Tillman had no purchase on a man like that. It was the only kind of person in Cawley that Tillman could not reach. And Della had not known until that moment that such a person existed within 50 miles. Tillman's smile came back, thinner now. There's no call for it to be ugly, he said. If you want to assume the woman's debt, that's your business, and a poor one. Briggs. Briggs came forward with a key. He unlocked the iron from the rail and from Della's wrists, and her arms came down, and she could not feel them. And she would have gone to her knees if Amos had not caught her under the elbow with a hand the size of a skillet and held her up like she weighed nothing. Receipt, Amos said. Tillman went inside and wrote it out, and Amos went in after him and wrote the draft, and Della stood on the boardwalk swaying and looking at the dark street and the yellow windows, and the people she could see now had drifted to those windows to watch. Finally, now that it was over, now that it was safe to look. Amos came back out folding a paper into his coat. He put it away careful. Then he took off his own heavy coat, which must have been warm as a stove from the inside of it, and he put it around Della's shoulders without asking and without any ceremony about it. And he said, Can you climb up? Or do I lift you? I can climb, she said. It came out as a whisper. It was the first thing she had said to him. She could not climb. He lifted her onto the wagon bench like she was a sack of seed, gentle about it. And he climbed up beside her and turned the horse, and they went out the south end of the street into the dark and the snow. And the town of Cawley let them go without a word, the way it had watched her freeze without a word, and Della Mercer rode away from the place that had chained her wrapped in the coat of a man whose name she had heard spoken once and could not, just then, remember. His name was Amos Carrow, and he ranched the Sweetbrush for sections of good grass and a long meadow on the far side of the river from the lodgepole country. And Della learned all of this slowly, over the first days, because Amos was not a man who told you things. He was a man you found things out about by being near him. She found out about the ranch by riding into it through the dark that first night, the horse knowing the way, the dim shape of a long, low house coming up out of the snow with one window lit. She found out about his wife by the things in the house, a sampler stitched in a careful hand and framed by the door, a woman's shawl still hanging on a peg where it had clearly hung a long time untouched, a child's small chair by the cold hearth. She found out the rest, eventually, but not that night. That night he carried her in and set her by a fire he built up fast and high, and he heated water and gave her coffee she could barely hold, and an old dog with a gray muzzle and one milky eye came and lay against her feet and groaned and gave her his warmth without being asked. Amos did not crowd her. He set food in front of her, a thick stew kept warm at the back of the stove, bread, and he did not watch her eat it, which she was grateful for. because she ate it the way a starving animal eats, with both hands and no dignity at all, and she would not have wanted to be watched. When she was done, he showed her a small room off the main one with a narrow bed made up clean, and he said it had been kept for company that never came, which she understood later was not quite true, and he said good night, and he left her alone, and she lay down in her clothes under 3 wool blankets and slept for 14 hours. She woke to gray light and the smell of bacon and the sound of a man moving carefully in the next room so as not to wake her, which he had failed at, but the failure was kind. She came out. Amos was at the stove. The dog thumped his tail on the floor. There was a place set at the table. "I'm not in the habit of taking charity," Della said, because she had decided in the night that she would say it first thing, before anything else could be assumed. Amos turned around with a plate in his hand. He looked at her for a moment. "I didn't take you for charity," he said. "Sit down and eat, and when you've eaten you can tell me what's true and what isn't, and we'll go from there. That suit you?" It suited her. She sat down and she ate, more slowly this time, with the manners coming back, and when the plates were cleared she told him. She told him about Thomas and the homestead and the patent. She told him about Tillman and the note and the creek. She told him about the quitclaim she would not sign and the cattle they took and the magistrate's paper and the chain. She told it plainly, in order, without weeping, because she had done all her weeping already that year, and there was none left for telling. Amos listened the whole way through without interrupting once. He had a way of listening that made you want to be accurate. When she finished, he sat back and was quiet a while, and the dog snored, and the fire ticked. "You said the place was patented," he said finally. "Proved up. The government granted it outright. Thomas got the paper last year. The final certificate. I saw it. He showed it to me at this very kind of table in our own house, and he said, 'Della, this ground is ours now. No man can take it. It's written down in Washington.'" She looked at her hands. I believed him. He was likely right. Amos got up and refilled the coffee. A patented homestead's a different animal from a claim. And there's a thing about it most folks don't know, that I only know because a cousin of mine got caught the wrong side of it once. He sat back down. "Land you get under the homestead law can't be taken for a debt you ran up before the patent came through. It's in the act itself. The government means for the homestead to be safe, so a man can't lose the land he proved up over old debts. If Tillman's note was signed before your patent issued, then that note can't touch the land. Not legally, no matter what Pew signs." Della sat very still. "The note was 1880, she said. "The patent was last year. 1883. Amos nodded slowly. "Then the land was never his to take and never yours to owe him for. The cattle, maybe. The note's good against the cattle and the goods. But not the ground. Not the creek." He looked at her. "Do you have the patent?" And there it was. The thing she had been circling for 2 days without letting herself look at it directly, because looking at it meant hoping, and hoping had become a dangerous thing to do. "I don't know," she said. "Tillman's men went through the cabin in October when they came for the cattle. I came back from the Hadley place, and the trunk was open and things were on the floor. I thought they took it. I've thought all this time they took it, and that without it I had nothing to stand on, that it would be his word as a banker against mine as a debtor, and who in that town was going to take my word?" She stopped. Her voice had gone thin. "But they didn't make me sign. That's the thing I keep coming back to. If they had the patent, if they could prove it didn't exist or that it was forfeit, they wouldn't have needed my signature. They'd have just taken it. They needed me to sign it over. Which means they couldn't find it either," Amos said quietly. "If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." They went back for it the next morning. Amos hitched the wagon and brought a rifle, not because he expected to use it, but because a man going onto contested ground in that country went armed the way he went dressed, without thinking much about it. The dog came too, riding in the wagon bed with his gray muzzle into the wind. The snow had stopped in the night, and the sky had come up hard and blue and bitter cold, and the lodgepole country lay white and silent under it, the creek a black thread in all that white, the cabin a small dark shape with no smoke coming from the chimney, because there had been no one to light a fire in it for 2 months. Della had not been back since October. She had thought she would feel something large walking into it. Instead, she felt the particular grief of a house that has gone cold, which is a smaller and meaner grief than the big ones, The grief of a kettle gone to rust on a dead stove, of a bed left unmade because the person who would have made it stopped being there to care. Tillman's men had not been gentle. The trunk stood open by the wall, its contents pulled out and dropped. Thomas's good shirt that she had been saving, the wedding quilt, the tin of letters from her mother in Ohio. She knelt and went through it all again with Amos standing in the doorway letting the light in, and the patent was not there. She had known it would not be there. She had looked 100 times in her memory. "It's not in the trunk," she said. "It was never in the trunk. He wouldn't have kept it in the trunk. That's the first place anyone would look." She sat back on her heels. She made herself think the way Thomas would have thought, which was something she had been learning to do all year, to borrow his mind when hers ran out. Thomas had been a careful man with paper. He kept the seed catalog and the brand registration and the receipts in a wooden box on the shelf. But the patent he had treated differently. She remembered him holding it. She remembered him saying, "This one we keep somewhere safe. Della, this one's the whole place in 8 inches of paper. Somewhere safe. Not the trunk and not the box. Somewhere he had thought about." She stood up and walked the cabin slow, the way she had watched Thomas walk a fence line, looking not at the obvious things, but at the places between the obvious things. The hearth, the puncheon floor, the 2 shelves, the window casing. She came to the back wall where Thomas had built in a narrow cupboard for the crockery, a homely thing, slightly crooked because he was a better stockman than a carpenter and never minded saying so. She had used that cupboard every day of her married life, and she had never once thought about the fact that it stood a hand's width out from the wall at the bottom, where the floor was uneven, with a gap behind it you would never see unless you got down low and looked. She got down low and looked. "Amos," she said, "bring me the light." He brought a candle. She held it to the gap and saw, wedged flat against the back of the cupboard, held up off the floor and the damp by 2 thin laths Thomas had nailed there, a flat oilskin packet, the kind a man wraps a thing in when he means it to last. It had been there the whole time. Through October and the men going through the trunk, through November and the chain in the snow, through every hour she had spent believing she had nothing to stand on. It had been 8 inches behind the crockery she ate off of, waiting. Her hands were shaking when she worked it loose, and not from the cold this time. She had to lie nearly flat on the floor to reach it, and she did not care. The packet came free with a small tearing sound where the oilskin had stuck to a nail head. She sat up with it in her lap. Amos crouched beside her, holding the candle, saying nothing, giving her the moment to herself the way he had given her the meal to herself that first night. She unfolded the oilskin. Inside was a second wrapping, a square of clean cotton, and inside that the papers, 3 of them, flat and dry and unmarked by the 2 cold months. She lifted the top one into the candlelight. It was the patent, the final Homestead certificate. She read it slowly because the words had a weight that made fast reading feel disrespectful. "The United States of America," it said at the top, in a heavy printed hand, "to all to whom these presents shall come, greeting." And below that, in the clerk's careful script, the grant. "To Thomas Mercer, the southwest quarter of Section 14, in Township 49 north, of Range 79 west of the 6th principal meridian, containing 160 acres." And the language she had not understood at the table when Thomas read it to her, and understood now, every word of it, to have and to hold the said tract of land, with the appurtenances thereof, unto the said Thomas Mercer, and to his heirs and assigns forever. His heirs, her, and the date of issue, the 11th of June, 1883, and the seal of the General Land Office, embossed deep into the paper, and the recorder's stamp from the county at Fenton showing it had been filed and recorded in Book 9 of Patents at page 204, on the 3rd of July, 1883. Recorded, filed with the county, 8 months before Thomas died. The whole place in 8 inches of paper, exactly like he had said. The second paper was the water right, the appropriation Thomas had filed for the use of Lodgepole Creek, dated 1878, the year of the original entry, which under the law of the dry country meant his claim to that water came before any claim made after it, and Tillman's use of that creek for his 4,000 head had come after it, all of it, every year. First in time. The oldest right on the creek belonged to the southwest quarter of Section 14, and the southwest quarter of Section 14 belonged to the heirs of Thomas Mercer forever, and the heir of Thomas Mercer was sitting on the cold floor of her own cabin, holding the proof of it in 2 hands that would not stop shaking. The third paper was in Thomas's own hand. It was a single sheet, folded once, and on it he had written, in the slow square letters of a man who did not write often and made it count when he did, the note for the bank. He had set down the date of the note, 1880, and the amount, and beside it he had written, in his own words, the thing Amos had told her that morning at the breakfast table. The land cannot answer for this debt. The debt is older than the patent. The Act of Congress says so plain. If anything happens to me, Della, take this to a lawyer in Fenton and not to anyone in Cawley. Tillman knows the law better than he lets on. Do not let him tell you the land is gone. The land is not gone. The land is ours, and then it is yours, and no paper he ever drew up can change one word of these 3 pages. He had known. He had sat at the table and read her the patent and let her think it was a happy thing, a thing to be proud of, and the whole time some part of him had been afraid of exactly what came, and he had wrapped the proof in oilskin and nailed it behind the crockery and written her a letter telling her what to do. And then he had said nothing more about it, because that was Thomas, who carried the heavy things himself and only set them down where you would find them after he was gone. Della Mercer sat on the floor of her cold cabin and wept, finally, after a year of having none left, and Amos Carrow knelt beside her with the candle burning down and did not touch her and did not tell her to stop and did not say a single useless word. And the old dog came and put his gray head in her lap, and outside the snow lay white and silent over 160 acres of ground that had been hers the whole time. They did not go to Cawley. They went to Fenton, the county seat, 2 days later, when the worst of the cold had broken and the road was passable, and they went to a lawyer named Harlan Voss, whose name Amos knew and trusted. Voss was an old man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles pushed up on his forehead, and he had a way of reading a document that involved a great deal of silence and small sounds in his throat. Della laid the 3 papers on his desk and told him the story for the second time in her life, and Voss listened the way Amos had listened, with an attention that made her careful, and when she was done he picked up the patent and read it, and then the water right, and then Thomas's letter, and then he set them down and took his spectacles off and cleaned them on his vest, which Della would learn was a thing he did when he had made up his mind. Mrs. Mercer, Voss said, your husband was a more careful man than most lawyers I have known. He was a stockman, Della said. He just paid attention. He paid attention to the right thing. Voss put his spectacles back on. You understand what you have here. The patent is recorded. There is no question of the title. The land passed to you on your husband's death as his sole heir, and the title is clean and whole and recorded at this courthouse, which I can have a clerk confirm within the hour. The water right is the senior right on Lodgepole Creek by a margin of years, and your husband was correct about the debt. The Homestead Act provides, in plain terms, that land acquired under it shall not become liable for any debt contracted before the patent issued. The bank's note dates from 1880. The patent issued in 1883. The note is good against the personal property, the cattle, the goods. It is worth precisely nothing against this land. It was worth nothing against this land the day Royce Tillman sat at your table and told you the land would answer for it. And he knew it was worth nothing, because a man does not draw up a quitclaim deed in advance and bring his own pen for land he believes is already forfeit. He needed your signature because your signature was the only thing in the world that could have given him that creek. And you did not sign. I didn't read it, Della said. I just knew Thomas wouldn't have wanted me to sign anything I hadn't read. Then your husband saved your land twice, Voss said. Once by keeping the paper, and once by raising a wife who reads before she signs. He gathered the 3 documents and squared them on the desk with the gentleness of a man handling something valuable. I will need to keep these long enough to make certified copies and to record an affidavit of heirship establishing your title formally. A day, 2 at the most. After that, I would suggest, with your permission, that I write a letter to Mr. Tillman and a second letter to Magistrate Pugh, and that those letters set out the facts very plainly and very calmly, and that they make certain reference to the matter of a woman chained to a public hitch rail in a snowstorm over a debt that did not exist, which is a matter that the territorial courts at Cheyenne would find of considerable interest if it were ever to come before them. Della looked at him. You'd threaten him. I would inform him, Voss said, of his position, which is far worse than he currently understands it to be. A man who falsely imprisons a widow to extort a fraudulent conveyance has exposed himself to a great deal. Mrs. Mercer, and Mr. Tillman has built his life on never being exposed to anything. I find that men like that grow very reasonable very quickly when the wind changes. We will not need the courts. The letter will be enough." He almost smiled. "But it will be a very good letter." The land office confirmed the title that afternoon. The clerk brought the heavy book down, and there it was, Book 9, page 204, recorded in July of 1883 in the firm hand of a clerk now 2 years dead. The whole transaction sitting in the public record where it had sat the entire time, available to anyone in Cawley who had cared to ride 2 days to Fenton and look, which no one had, because no one had thought a widow with 11 head of cattle was worth the ride. They had all decided what was true without reading the page. The town had walked past her in the snow for the same reason it had never checked the book. It was easier to believe Tillman, and it cost nothing, and it asked nothing of them, until it turned out to have cost a great deal, though they did not know that yet. The valuation Voss arranged came in the following week, and it was the kind of number that did not make Della rich, but did something better. It made her safe. The 160 acres of creek bottom, appraised by a man the bank itself had used for years, came to a sum that would have cleared the false debt 4 times over. But the appraiser had set that aside, almost as an afterthought, and pointed instead at the water. The senior right to Lodgepole Creek, in a country where 4,000 head of cattle would die without it, where every junior right on that creek depended on the senior right not being enforced against them, was worth, the appraiser said, more than the land it watered. It was worth, in fact, whatever Royce Tillman would have to pay every year for the rest of his life to be allowed to keep watering his cattle from a creek whose oldest claim now belonged, beyond any argument, to Della Mercer. She read the appraisal at Amos's table, by the fire, with the dog at her feet. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it with the patent and the water right and Thomas's letter in a flat tin box Amos had given her for the purpose, and she sat for a while looking at the fire. "He didn't leave me a piece of paper," she said. Amos was mending a bridle across the table, and he did not look up, but he had stopped working, which was how she knew he was listening. "I thought, this whole time, that all I'd lost when I couldn't find it was a piece of paper. But he didn't leave me a piece of paper. He left me the creek. He left me the one thing in this whole country that Royce Tillman can't live without, and he hid it behind the crockery, and he wrote me a letter telling me how to use it. He spent his last good months being afraid for me and not letting me see it. And then he made sure I'd be all right anyway." Her voice did not break. She had decided it would not. "That's not a piece of paper. That's a man taking care of his wife from the other side of the ground." Amos set the bridle down. "He sounds like he was worth knowing," he said. "He was the best man I ever met," Della said. Then, because it was true and because she had learned that year that you said the true things while you could, she added, "until lately." Amos picked the bridle back up, but there was color in his neck above the beard, and he worked at the leather a while without getting much done. Voss's letter went to Cawley by the regular mail, and the answer came faster than the mail should have allowed, which told Della everything about how the wind had changed. Tillman did not write back. Tillman came. He came alone, in a buggy, on a cold, bright morning a week before Christmas, and he pulled up in the Sweetbrush yard and did not get down, and Amos went out to meet him with the dog at his heel, and Della stood in the doorway with her arms folded, wearing a dress that had been Margaret Carrow, which Amos had quietly told her she should use rather than let the moths have, and which fit her well enough. Tillman looked older in the daylight than he had in the bank doorway. He looked like a man who had not slept. He had a way of holding his head that Della recognized now, the way a man holds his head when he is trying to look like he is in control of a thing that has gotten away from him. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. He did not get down from the buggy. Perhaps he understood that he had not earned the ground. "I've had a letter from your lawyer." "I know," Della said. "I asked him to write it." "There seems to have been," Tillman said, and stopped, and started again, "a misunderstanding. About the title. I was acting on information that I now understand to have been incomplete." "You weren't acting on incomplete information," Della said. She said it quietly, the way Amos said things, because she had learned that too. "You drew up a quitclaim and brought your own pen to my kitchen because you knew the land was mine and the only way to take it was to make me give it to you. You knew the debt couldn't touch it. You knew the patent was recorded at Fenton. You just bet that I didn't know and that the town wouldn't check, and that a widow alone in the snow would sign anything to make the cold stop. That's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Tillman. That's the most careful thing you ever did. It just didn't work. Tillman was silent. Behind him the buggy horse stamped and blew a cloud of frost. The dog sat in the snow and watched him with one good eye and one milky one and did not look away. "What do you want?" Tillman said at last. It was the only honest thing he had ever said to her. "I want the receipt for the false debt sent to my lawyer, marked paid by Amos Carrow, so the record's clean. I want the 11 head of cattle returned, or their value at the full price, which Mr. Voss has calculated. And I want it understood, in writing, that the senior water right on Lodgepole Creek belongs to me." She paused. "After that, Mr. Tillman, we can talk about the creek like two people who own things and need to come to terms about them. You need that water. I have it. I'm not Thomas. I'm not going to tell you no out of pride for 6 years. I'll lease you the use of it, fairly, by a paper Mr. Voss draws up, and we both sign and both keep a copy of. You'll pay every year, and every year you'll remember where the water comes from. That's the part one want most, if I'm honest. Not the money. I want you to write me a draft every spring for the rest of your life, and remember, when you do, the afternoon you chain me to a rail and the whole town walked past." She had thought, before she said it, that she would feel something hard and good when she finally said it to his face. Vengeance was the word for what she had expected to feel. But what she felt, watching Royce Tillman sit in his buggy unable to meet her eyes, was something flatter and quieter and more honest than vengeance. She felt that he was a small man who had built a large life out of other people's fear, and that the fear was gone now, at least hers was, and that without it he was just a tired old man in a cold buggy who had lost the one thing he had spent 6 years trying to steal. There was no satisfaction in it that she could hold on to. There was only the fact of it. She had won, and he had lost, and the winning did not bring Thomas back or unfreeze the afternoon in the snow, and she understood, standing in Margaret Carrow dress in Amos Carrow doorway, that this was the truth nobody told you about being wronged and then made right. The rightness did not erase the wrong. It only sat next to it. "You carry both. I'll have Voss draw up the lease," Tillman said. He picked up the reins. He still had not looked at her. "The cattle will be at your place by week's end. The water terms, I'll agree to whatever's fair." "I don't suppose," he said, and for one moment something almost human came up in his face, "that an apology would mean anything to you." "No," Della said. "It wouldn't. But you can offer it anyway, if it'll help you sleep. I find I don't much care anymore whether you sleep." He turned the buggy and drove out of the yard, and that was the last time Royce Tillman ever spoke to her directly, though his drafts came every spring after that, on time, for the rest of his life, which was not as long as he had planned on. There was a boy, though. She had not forgotten the boy. His name was Tobias Deakins, and he was 19, and he had been Pugh's deputy, which meant he had been Tillman's, and on the afternoon she was chained he had been the one Briggs sent to stand watch over her, to make sure no soft-hearted townsperson cut her loose. He had stood across the street most of that afternoon, a thin boy in a coat too big for him, and he had not looked at her, and he had not stopped anyone from walking past, and he had not done the one thing that might have cost him his place, which was to walk over and unlock the chain and let Royce Tillman do his worst about it. He had been afraid, and his fear had been part of the thing that held her to that rail, and Della had seen his face once across the street and seen the shame in it even then, the shame of a boy who knew exactly what he was failing to do and did not have it in him yet to do. Otherwise, he came to the Sweetbrush in January, on foot, having quit Pugh's service or been let go, she never learned which. He stood in the yard turning his hat in his hands the way young men do, and he said he had come to say he was sorry, that he had thought about it every day, that he should have cut the chain and let them hang the consequences, and he had not had the spine, and that he understood if she wanted to set the dog on him, which made the dog, who liked everyone, thump his tail. Della came out and looked at him a long time. And here is the thing she was honest with herself about, then and always, the thing she never told the boy and never told Amos and only ever told the inside of her own head on the long nights. She forgave Tobias Deakins easily. She forgave him completely, in about the time it took him to finish his stammered apology, and she told him to come in out of the cold and have coffee, and she meant it. And she did not forgive Royce Tillman, not then and not ever, and she never would. And the truth was that the two of them had done the same thing. The boy had stood across the street and let her freeze. Tillman had given the order that put her there. But the boy had only failed to be brave, which was the most common failure in the world and the one she understood best because she had failed at it herself 100 times, and Tillman had been deliberate and cold and had known the law and used her ignorance like a tool. She told herself it was the difference between them that mattered, the cruelty against the cowardice, and there was something in that. But underneath it, in the place where she did not lie to herself, she knew the real reason she forgave the one and not the other. She liked the boy. She had looked at his ashamed young face and seen something worth saving, and she had not seen anything worth saving in Tillman, and so she had given the boy the grace she withheld from the man. It was not justice. Justice would have weighed only what they did. It was preference. It was the human thing, the small, ordinary thing, of forgiving the face you can stand to look at and not the one you can't. She made her peace with that. A person was allowed, she decided, to be a person and not a court of law. She let the boy come in for coffee, and he came back in the spring to help with the calving for wages, and he turned into a good hand and a better man, and she was glad, all her life, that she had given him the grace. She just never pretended to herself that she had given it for the right reason. Thomas had taught her to read before she signed. The year had taught her to look at her own reasons before she trusted them. Both were a kind of carefulness, and she had come to think they were the most useful thing a person could own. The spring came up green to the stirrup, the way it had the year Thomas filed the entry, and Della Mercer ran her own cattle on her own creek bottom with the help of a hired boy who had once watched her freeze, and Royce Tillman's first lease draft arrived in April, and she cashed it and did not feel much of anything, which she counted as a kind of healing. She kept the lodgepole place. She thought about going back to live in the cabin, and she went out and stood in it one warm afternoon, and she found that the cold that had gotten into the house when it sat empty had not entirely left, and that she did not want to sleep there anymore, with or without the patent behind the crockery. So she leased the grazing and let the cabin stand, and she went on living at the Sweetbrush, which had stopped being a thing anyone needed to explain. Because the other thing that happened that spring, the thing that happened so slowly that neither of them could ever afterward name the day it became true, was that Amos Carrow stopped being a man who had done her a kindness and became a man she could not picture the rest of her life without. It was in the suppers, eaten at 6 because Amos liked to eat at 6 and Della had come to like it too, the two of them and the old dog, and after April the deacon's boy, talking about fence and water and the price of feed in Fenton. It was in the way Amos had started, without either of them remarking on it, to ask her opinion before he made a decision about the place, the way a man asks a partner and not a guest. It was in the sampler by the door that Margaret had stitched, which Della had offered once to take down, and which Amos had asked her to leave up, and which she understood was not a barrier between them but the opposite, a sign that this was a man who did not let go of the people he had loved, which meant that if he ever came to love her, she would be loved the same stubborn way, all the way to the ground and past it. He told her about Margaret one evening on the porch when the light hung on past when you expected dark. The fever winter, 2 years gone. Margaret and the baby both, for days apart, and Amos digging 2 graves in the frozen hill behind the barn because the ground would not wait, and neither would his grief. He told it plainly, in order, the way she had told him about Thomas that first morning, and she understood that he had been waiting until he could tell it without it taking him apart, the same way she had waited to tell hers, and that the two of them telling each other their dead was a thing that could only happen between people who had decided to trust each other with the heavy things. "I didn't take you in for charity," he said, at the end of it, repeating what he had said that first morning, and she understood now what he had meant by it and had not been able to say. "I took you in because I rode into that town and saw a woman the whole world had decided to walk past, and I'd spent 2 years feeling like that woman, like the world had walked past me and Margaret and the baby, and kept right on going. And I couldn't fix mine, but I could fix yours. I could at least do that." He looked out at the meadow going gold in the last light. "I didn't know you'd fix mine back." Della did not say anything for a while. The dog snored. The mountains held their snow against the blue. "You asked me once," she said, "what was true and what wasn't. The truest thing I know is that Thomas took care of me from the other side of the ground, and I'll be grateful to him as long as I live. And the second truest thing I know is that I'd like to be done being taken care of and start the part where 2 people take care of each other. If that's a thing you'd want." "It's the thing I'd want," Amos said. They were married in Fenton in June, by a judge and not a Cawley preacher, with Harlan Voss as a witness and the deacon's boy holding the dog, and Della Carrow kept the lodgepole title in her own name, which Voss had advised and Amos had insisted on, because a man who has read the Homestead Act understands that a woman should never again have to wonder whether the ground beneath her belongs to her or to someone who can take it. She went back to the cabin one last time before the wedding, alone, on a warm afternoon with the creek running full and loud with the snow melt off the bighorns. She did not go in. She stood in the dooryard where Thomas had stood 1,000 times, and she looked at the creek, the black thread gone silver in the spring, the water that had turned out to be the whole point of everything. The water Thomas had claimed in 1878 when the grass came up green to the stirrup and the country looked like a promise. She thought about the oilskin packet behind the crockery, dry through 2 cold months, the patent and the water right, and the letter in his slow square hand. The land is not gone. The land is ours, and then it is yours. She had thought, that winter, chained to the rail with the snow finding her collar, that she had nothing. The town had thought so too. Royce Tillman had built his whole cruel patient scheme on the certainty that a widow with 11 head of cattle and no paper she could find was a thing the world could walk past. And the truth had been sitting in a courthouse book at Fenton and behind the crockery in her own kitchen the entire time. 8 inches of paper that said she had been the rightful owner of the best water in the country on the very afternoon they left her in the snow to freeze. It had never been nothing. It had only been waiting for someone to read it. She stood in the dooryard a while longer, and then she turned and walked back to where Amos waited with the wagon and the dog, and the creek ran on behind her the way it had run before any of them came and would run after all of them were gone. And Della Mercer, who would be Della Carrow by the end of the week, climbed up onto the bench beside the man she had chosen, and they drove home in the long gold light, and the ground beneath the wheels was hers, every foot of it, written down and recorded and beyond the reach of any man who had ever thought her too small to bother reading about. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.